Since science fiction was named in 1925 and 1926, there have been countless novels published in the genre. Some have become famous, many languish in obscurity. But is the tyranny of the popular a problem? Do we see and hear about the same books over and over and over again? Are we hearing about the right books? Well, I decided to ask you, my viewers, who you thought were the most overrated science fiction writers of all time. The results may not surprise you, but they may enlighten, and they may encourage you to try other writers. So without further ado, let's move on. Look at those bottom 5 or top 5, and then we'll get into your comments. Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. After that preamble, as you can see, today we are into the top 5 most overrated science fiction writers stroke novels. This is based on a poll and some questioning I did on my channel. I received comments, emails, what have you, and I've boiled them all down to the things you might expect, because of course things which are most likely to be overrated are things which are famous and popular. It's not that the books are bad in themselves, they could be very good. It's just that they get an undue amount of attention compared to things that people think are far, far better. It's also the tyranny of the popular. You get told over and over again by the mass media, by people, by critics, what have you, that fundamentally this is a great work, this is a great work. But art is about individuality, so we should be free to choose. So let's have a look at the top 5 in descending order, or should we say the bottom 5. Robert A. Heinlein has long divided science fiction readers, despite his massive acclaim in the Golden Age era and onwards into the 50s, and his more controversial novels of the 1960s. Heinlein is seen as one of the key architects of modern SF, though not contemporary SF, and his influence still looms large. But he came in at number 5. He had a big oeuvre, and you'd expect almost certain books to be mentioned as being amongst the worst, but people generally just said Heinlein per se. So obviously Heinlein's cachet broadened considerably in the early 1960s with Stranger in a Strange Land, which is one of the best-selling science fiction novels of all time. This is a really nice NEL copy, a UK copy from the late 70s. And fundamentally, I found this unreadable as a young SF reader after reading people like John Wyndham, H.G. Wells, Philip K. Dick. And I've read it about 1.5 times. I'm going to read it again, and I really struggle with it. However, there are things by Heinlein I really like. For example, I really enjoyed Orphans of the Sky, his Generation Starship story from much earlier in his career, which I think is great and very influential. For example, Joe Jim, the character there with 2 heads, is the inspiration for Zaphod Beeblebrox in Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Interestingly, Adams did get a mention, and later on in the video I'm going to go through some comments on the channel and respond to people's comments and talk about the other authors who people feel are overrated. These are the ones who just got the most votes. Then we have a contemporary writer who's been working for about 25-30 years now. I don't have any of his books. I have read some. He's never done a lot for me, and that's John Scalzi. A particular book wasn't mentioned. One person mentioned one book, but it's pretty much like anything by John Scalzi. And I have to say, I've always found him a bit of a lightweight. He's not the sort of writer I like. So your comments on that, please, to say more about Scalzi, because I don't really feel I've examined enough of his work to give a fuller sort of critical reason why. It's just he didn't work for me. It seemed to be the same old thing as far as I was concerned. Then at number 3, we have, one of the sort of obvious sort of go-to guys. I work as a bookseller, as my channel name suggests, and have done for many, many years. And a few years back, I remember seeing a young guy coming along and saying to a friend, oh, Isaac Asimov, he's the go-to guy for science fiction. And, while that may have been the case at one point, And while you could argue that, there's never been one go-to guy for science fiction, with a possible exception of H.G. Wells. This is Foundation, of course, and Asimov was mentioned many times in the poll. The Foundation books came up the most because they come so heavily laden with expectation. And that, of course, is the real problem that we have with anything popular. It's our expectation is laden with expectation. We are told, we are led to believe that these are the great works. And of course, things change over time. It's undoubted that, these are seminal in their importance, but are they well written? I would say no. For me, Asimov is much better later on. In the 50s, his first two robot novels are far superior. Interestingly, I, Robot was mentioned. Of course, it's a collection of early robot short stories. But for me, as I say, I think when Asimov gets to the 50s and writes the first two robot novels, he is a better writer. He's beginning to get a command of character. And you can see how those books influenced even the likes of Philip K. Dick, a far superior writer in a literary sense, some years after that. So Ike, unfortunately, came in. So really, there are no surprises here. We are seeing the sort of writers you'd expect to see. Coming in at number 2 is an actual book. I guess you could say it's the writer, but only one book was mentioned. And that's his most famous book, and it's the first in a trilogy. And it's a book which has been a massive international bestseller for some years now. And that, of course, is The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. Now, if I'm mispronouncing that, don't give me a lecture underneath on how to pronounce it. I'm not really that bothered. I'm not Chinese, I'm Welsh. The main thing is that we read and we can spell. As long as we can spell it, we're okay. So The Three-Body Problem is, of course, massive international bestseller. It's been a Netflix TV series. And interestingly, a friend of mine who doesn't read SF and regards it as a load of junk watched the series and said, oh, the ideas are really, really amazing. And I said, yeah, but what's the execution like? And you can read this book, and I don't really want to go to a lengthy preamble about it. It's just really, really badly written. Now, some people have argued that that's the translation, and because Chinese being structured different to English, it doesn't come across as well. But there are videos by Chinese readers on YouTube who say, actually, no, it is badly written. So it's either badly written or badly translated. My suspicion is that it's badly written. It's translated by Ken Liu, who has a pedigree in these things. And while a good translator may to a degree edit and rewrite, and you can never capture the feel of an original in a translation, so we have to bear that in mind. This is a classic example of a book with lots of ideas, but with very poor prose and very poor characterization indeed. It is, however, far better than the TV series, as these things always are. But this really came in for a real kicking in the poll I set. Finally, and you're thinking this is going to be a short video, but we will go into more subjective comments from me about what I think of these books later on in the video and responding to your comments. We have the obvious number one, which I would have put as number one without even doing a poll, and that's Dune by Frank Herbert, of course. This is the SF Masterworks hardcover edition, the first thus of the hardcover, with a jacket rather than laminated boards. And of course, the problem with Dune is it's so famous. Again, it's expectation. It was a huge bestseller in the 1960s. There's been film versions, television adaptations. The TV adaptation is the best one, in my view. And it comes very heavily laden. The thing I've always found with Dune is the prose is very leaden. It's more like a dynastic fantasy than a science fiction novel. There is no doubt at all that it is a science fiction novel, of course. The best idea, and of course, is the Butlerian Jihad, which is hardly mentioned. And yeah, it's no surprise that this would come up as being the most overrated science fiction novel you would think of. It's going to be something famous. It's not going to be something obscure. Some more literary things do come up in the comments, and we'll go through those in a moment. So we're looking then, those are the sort of bottom 5, the worst 5. But other people didn't escape. So, having addressed the list bit, the clickbait bit of this video, the top 5, the worst, the most overrated, with hardly any surprises. Though John Scalzi, I think, came in for quite a kicking there, as I say, when really it could have been any number of other people. So let's have a look at the comments, look at some of the books as well, and I'll give you my view on this. And I'm going to sort of do approximations of people's handles because sometimes they're unpronounceable jaw breaks and have numbers and things in there. But David Castillo said that he found my channel through Bookpill. Good old Matt. Thanks, Matt. And has been grateful ever since. So have I, of course, so have I. Keep up the inspired work. On the topic of overrated, a name that pops into my head is James Blish. Now, I am in sympathy with this. What David goes on to say is Black Easter is one of my favourite books, but as I get through more of his catalogue, he's just so wildly uneven. Now, I completely agree with this, and I have said on the channel before that I think he is very, very uneven. And David goes on to say that even the Case of Conscience is wildly uneven, in his opinion. He says he's got loads of respect for him, and his writing can be amongst the most erudite in the genre. But if you want a masterclass in how to write with an authoritative voice, Blish is the guy. But he feels like the density and talent of his writing masks some pretty significant flaws like pacing and characterization. I think he may well have a point. I mean, I haven't read this for a long time and I really enjoyed it. Incidentally, I don't actually think it's a science fiction novel, and I'll tell you why. This may be a spoiler. I'm not going to go into detail, but when you get to the end and there's the cataclysmic event at the end, you've got to think about what is implied and what triggers that event. And what triggers it isn't a scientific thing, it's a religious thing, it's a supernatural thing. So there is some argument to suggest that A Case of Conscience is a fantasy novel. But I'll come back to that when I reread it, because I haven't read it for decades and decades, and I'm going to reread the whole After Such Knowledge series, which of course is this, Black Easter, The Death to Judgment, and Dr. Mirabilis, the historical novel, which most people ignore when reading this series. It's just a thematic series. So yeah, so I'm in sympathy with David there. I think Blish is uneven. I was a big fan of The Seedling Stars, his Pantropy book, and I reread that recently, and I covered it in a video on the channel about a year ago, because I think it's the source of things like Children of Time. And very much, when I read it, it wasn't as good as I remembered, and it certainly was uneven. So, David, I'm with you. Blish can be uneven. But I think that's true of a lot of genre writers who came up in the magazine era, particularly. Most writers who are not bestsellers have to keep writing to survive. It's better than going to work. Not that it isn't work, it is work. I can tell you, having written books myself. And it's very much one of those things where hardly anybody is on a level all the way through. That's quite uncommon. Even some of the very greatest science fiction writers will have clunkers in their catalogue, you know, and that's common to writers per se. So we mustn't be too harsh. What else have we got? We'll scan through some more, and let's see. I need to go down quite a bit because this video has got lots of other comments on it, so bear with me. I need to go down just a bit to, let's see, to Sylvan Young, who is, hi Sylvan, who's been watching the channel for ages and is a great guy. Let me just find him. Here we go. He also says Happy New Year, because I put this question up a while ago. And, you know, it has been slightly unhappy because of this break. But thanks very much for that, Sylvan. And he says, underrated authors. Truth be told, sometimes I feel like the kid who seems the emperor naked but doubts his sight. So I agree with the smarter mass and remark, brilliant, well done. But sometimes I think, am I missing something? He says he doesn't get Peter F. Hamilton, Robert A. Heinlein and Frank Herbert, the three H's. I'm with him on all of those. Peter's a great guy. I've met him. He's a lovely chap, very popular. His book, The Reality Dysfunction, is mentioned in my book. Have I got my book handy? No. 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, because he was for a long time the best-selling SF writer in the UK. His stars faded somewhat, but my feeling about him is that what he writes in 400 pages, a good writer would do in 40. I think there's an awful lot of padding and unnecessary detail. And you don't hear much about him. And interestingly, Peter did not win a single award until comparatively recently. So there you go. So that says that maybe, despite his popularity, critical consensus has generally been against him, which is interesting. Heinlein, of course, came up in the top 5. We could talk about Heinlein all day. Maybe we'll a bit later on. And also Frank Herbert as well. But, you know, these names are lauded. It is expectation again. So there you go. Who else have we got? Going down. I'm sorry about the slight delay on this, but I'm getting through the comments on this. Just a up comment and agree comment that sort of came up here is very, very much from Spencer Burke. Hi, Spencer, who watches the channel. And he said that even though a lot of people think Hyperion is Dan Simmons' best book, this is the UK first hardcover, that Song of Carly is the massively underrated one. And I would completely agree with that. Song of Carly, his first novel, is to me, in my mind, far better. But I like this, don't get me wrong. Simmons is a great entertainer, great storyteller. So there will be a video coming up with me telling you what I think you should read instead of these writers. Anyway, going down, Psychonaut56, who has his own New Wave SF channel, championing the best stuff, says that he didn't like Scalzi's red shirts. He also thinks that Ender's Game is overrated. So let's have a look at Ender's Game. This isn't a first. This is a first. This is a revised edition. This is a tall one from the USA. Quite pretty though, I think you'd agree. And I was in the hall at the Hugos in '87 when Speaker for the Dead, the sequel to Ender's Game, was up for the Hugo, and it was up against, I think it was Mona Lisa Overdrive. There were other things shortlisted as well, but it's going to be one of those two. And Card won, and I was greatly disappointed. I thought Gibson should have won, because, you know, he's a much, much better writer technically. But Psychonaut56 says, those two are probably the most overappreciated books I've ever read. I was always bored to death by Douglas Adams too. Well, there you go. Controversial. There it is. The old that's not a first printing. It's a first edition, but not a first printing. So yeah, I mean, my problem with Adams is he's very funny. He ripped Sheckley off enormously, of course. I don't care what anybody says. Loads of stuff comes from Robert Sheckley. And the problem with Hitchhikers, even though it's a funny book, is that it's really a parody or satire on science fiction. And the problem with people like who do funny SF, people like him and Pratchett, is that they get really popular and they give the rest of the literary world the idea that everything's just a joke within genre boundaries. And I find that infuriating. I really, really do. Psychonaut56 also says that Tolkien is the definition of second rate. Oops. Luckily, we're talking about science fiction, not fantasy. So there you go. Let's go on down and see what else we have. Okay, going down. Right. Okay. Somebody says, Michael Schneider says, I'm listening to Hyperion right now on Audible. Does the first chapter ever end? Lol. Well, of course it does, Michael. And I think I said in my reply to you, well, you know, listening to a book and reading is a totally different experience. Care what anybody says, you know, you should read it. It's different. I like Hyperion, like I said. Dr. Carnage 83 says, overrated books, in my opinion, would be Foundation, Dune, The Three-Body Problem, and anything by Heinlein. So there you go. I know the first two are beloved by lots of SF readers, but for me, they're overhyped. And when that happens, I'm bound to be let down. That's exactly what I said about expectation, isn't it? This is what happens. You know, it's inevitable. And that's the problem. It's the tyranny of the popular, isn't it? You know, we're all under the iron heel of what's supposed to be best and good. When in art, you should have your own ideas about these things and explore. I'm always attracted to the stuff which nobody talks about. If I go in a bookshop, because I go in a bookshop every day because I work in one, it's interesting watching people, because people will be attracted to things that look familiar. I'm attracted to things which look unfamiliar, and that's the way to become well read and widely read, to go for the unfamiliar. It won't always work, but sometimes it pays dividends, believe you me. So what else? Captain Mission says Andy Weir is overrated. Well, I think, you know, that's probably the case. So yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's sort of entry-level stuff, isn't it? It's science fiction for people who've never read any science fiction. It was a self-published book, one of the tiny, tiny number which crosses over. If you talk this to real science fiction writers about Andy Weir's work, well, he comes in for a bit of a slamming. You could say that it's professional jealousy because of his royalties, but his science has been massively critiqued, especially in something like that, which is fairly near future and engineering based. You've got to get it right, haven't you? You know. Captain Mission also says, I think Simmons is fantastic as he plays with genre, changes lanes from horror to SF and historical thriller. Flashback is a great read. So thanks for that, Captain Mission. Walter A13, Walter, hi Walter, you okay, mate? Very good guy. He goes into a banal rant, as he puts it. His rants are never banal. You can probably guess my annoyance for overhyping. Some books are intrinsically bad, some are just fine but undeserving of accolade. He talks about Chakraborty, of course, recent fantasy writer, Emily St. John Mandel. I mean, yeah, quite bland, really, Mandel, really. And Cezanne Liu. And he also has a go at Piers Anthony. Well, you would, wouldn't you? Piers Anthony, some of it's dreadful, you know. Really, really is. So, moving down. New Memeplex says that William Gibson is overrated outside of the initial trilogy. And I mean, that's quite a bold statement, but you know, I think it does deserve some discussion. I don't think there's any question really for me at all. There never has been about the importance of this book. This is the World hardcover first edition, first printing of Neuromancer from Gollancz. The True World first, of course, was the paperback from Ace, which also was reprinted, so be careful if you find one. This is the one that people want. This is signed as well. I got William to sign this for me. When was it? Just before the pandemic. That was the 4th or 5th time I met him, and as you'll know if you followed the channel, I've sort of said several anecdotes in the past about him. Outside the initial trilogy, well, he says, and pattern recognition is great as well. But I would say probably he does have a point. I want to go back to the trilogy from the 90s, the Bridge trilogy, which I suspect now possibly feels not dated. Nothing is dated, but more of its time than it should, because technology's moved very, very, very quickly, and Gibson was ahead of the curve. But I want to go back to those. But I have to say that for me, he's done 4 trilogies. He's on his 4th trilogy. He's obviously working on the last book in the 4th trilogy now. And I love the first trilogy. The second trilogy I need to go back to, but I wasn't as enamored of. The third trilogy, the Blue Ant trilogy, I think is magnificent. But of course, that's set, you know, pattern recognition is arguably set about 5 minutes in the future, but it's not really SF. But the beauty of it is that it feels like SF, and it shows you how science fiction and the contemporary world are one and the same thing now. So yeah, so maybe so. He says he's flat for him. Gibson can be challenging to read. He can be deliberately obtuse. If you witness the opening paragraph of The Peripheral, where he introduces 2 of the characters and he brings in their forenames and surnames but not together, and they're split up in a way which is infuriating. It gets you struggling to pull the 2 together, and that is kind of a cognitive dissonance thing which is common to SF, but it seemed needless to me in that particular context, because you know he can do cognitive dissonance with the best of one, and he didn't really need to do it with that. So I can understand why people sometimes critique him, even though I generally love him, I have to say. New Memeplex also says, not SF, but Terry Pratchett is overrated. Well, that goes without saying, doesn't it? Absolutely. iSound Info says, my overrated list includes Blindsight, The Three-Body Problem, Children of Time. Well, yeah, I mean, Blindsight is talked about an awful lot. It is really good. I like it. It's good. It's a shame that more people don't read Echopraxia. It's quasi-sequel, because it's a diptych, and because that's a good one as well. But really at the same time, both books, they smell of the way that things went in sort of post-human SF, late 80s, early 90s. Even though they were written this century, they do have a tinge which is quite sort of like 80s, 90s, which is not essentially a bad thing. But if you look back at the post-human SF that was emerging in the late 80s in the wake of cyberpunk, I mean, it is very much in that tradition. It's been not as groundbreaking as people think, but I like it. I think it's good. But yeah, it's had too much attention. Three-Body Problem, we don't really want to say any more about. Children of Time, I mean, Adrian, his problem, in my feeling, is that Adrian writes too much. He's written some great stuff. I mean, I'm a huge fan of The Dogs of War. I think it's beautifully written. I think it's got really strong moral messages. I think it's an exciting read, Bearhead, the sequel, not so much. And there we hit the problem of the unnecessary sequel. So he can do it, despite the fact that it does have precursors and things like Grant Morrison's We 3 graphic novel, which is sublime. But Children of Time, when I read it, you get people saying, oh, I love the spiders. I was bored by the spiders, probably because I'd read that sort of thing in James Blish's Seedling Stars. I was more interested in the human characters, and they are issues aboard the starship, which reminded me of a book by George Zabrowski, which was really good. I can't remember the title of it. I'll stick it in there. I'll stick it underneath the comments so I can recall the title. Ice74 also mentions Dahlgren, and he says, I know, sacrilege, lol. And yeah, I mean, I love Delaney, as you know, though there are times when there's certain of his works I've got frustrated. I mean, the one that people really get frustrated with a lot in the early works, when, you know, he's winning all those nebulas, is the Einstein intersection, aka a formless fabulous darkness. Is that right? A fabulous formless darkness. A fabulous formless darkness. It was retitled that briefly, and it went back to being the Einstein intersection. And people struggle with that because it doesn't info dump a lot. I went back to it and I loved it. Now, Dahlgren is rather like James Joyce. The place that James Joyce's Ulysses occupies in general modernist fiction, the position in SF would be Dahlgren. You know, it is a challenging book. It's got that wonderful circular structure which Alan Moore borrowed for Watchmen, where the beginning and the end link up, and you then get stuck in that loop and read the book forever, which would be just amazing. But I know a lot of people do find it overrated, and I think Dahlgren's too long. But then again, I think most big books are too long. As I've said before, much prefer Trouble on Triton, aka Triton. I think it's less ambitious but more successful. And that is one of my things. I think sometimes writers overreach their ambition, but maybe it's us. Maybe we're not up to it. You've got to take that on board as well. But a few people mentioned Dahlgren, so there you go. Ralph Marone says, hi Ralph, says, my partial list of overrated books. Dune, I liked it, but, and then an ellipsis. So there we go. Three Body Problem, hated this. More Than Human, Theodore Sturgeon, it was okay. And again, I did a video about Sturgeon called Salty Undisciplined Fish Eggs. Is Theodore Sturgeon overrated? And I have to agree, I think Sturgeon is overrated. You know, he's regarded as the first proper literary guy to come out of the golden age and out of Campbell's magazine. But again, the unevenness is there, like with Blish, but it's uneven within, you know, within a certain text. And More Than Human has some amazing prose in it and some brilliant stuff, but it also has these sloppy moments, and you just feel that Sturgeon probably wanted to lie down. And of course, he wrote lots of short stories and not so many novels. He didn't like writing novels. So, you know, there you go. It's just one of those things. I mean, Delaney, for example, reveres Sturgeon. And I did a video as well. I think I reviewed The Dream and Jewels in that particular video, which came across as a cross between Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes and Tom Reamy's Blind Voices, which obviously comes later than the Sturgeon. And there's some wonderful stuff in it, but there's some really uneven and childish stuff in it, which I really didn't like. But there you go. As I say, you've got to remember these guys, you know, writing under pressure. And I don't know a lot about Sturgeon's private life, but I understand it was quite interesting. So maybe that was a factor. Ralph Foster says Hyperion was the biggest disappointment. I can understand why people find Hyperion disappointment, because again, it's the old thing of expectation, isn't it? I mean, when I read Hyperion, when it first came out, I was familiar with Simmons' work because I'd read the early ones. I read Song of Kali, his first one, when it was first published. I've got a first edition here somewhere. And I like his writing. I think he's a really good entertainer, good storyteller. He's a popular writer, but he's not one who insults your imagination. And I read this at a time when I was really fed up and bored stupid with traditional genre SF. And I picked this up and I breezed through it, and I really enjoyed it. And the Canterbury Tales thing was obvious to me. I don't know who said that first. I think I was saying it back in the 90s, but it's an obvious thing to draw an analogy to. But of course, it's only part one, so it doesn't reach that climax. So does it sort of achieve a full conceptual breakthrough? No, it's just a pleasant reading experience. And I think you've got to read what follows to get the full thing. But even then, I would say it's more about the pleasure of reading somebody who can really handle prose really well and really smoothly and professionally. And that's why Dan Simmons, actually, I think Dan Simmons should be a lot more famous. I think the problem is that he's in that school that runs from Richard Matheson to Stephen King to him. And I talk to Stephen King fans all the time at work, and the number of them who've never heard of Dan Simmons is staggering, particularly with a huge number of horror novels that Simmons has written. And they're good mostly as well. I mean, some of them are better than others, but I would favour I Like This, Song of Carly I've mentioned. There's a great SF novel called The Hollow Man, which I think is really good, which reminded me of Silverberg a lot. Not as good as Silverberg, but it's in that ballpark of when he's tackling those key Silverbergian themes. So, yeah, you know, it's fair enough if you haven't read them all. The Sparrow. The Sparrow is a book which really divides people. Of course, The Sparrow is a mainstream bestseller and was pretty much marketed as a mainstream novel. So you've got to bear that in mind. Of course, there's the interminable dinner conversations and things, and it's a big chunky tome. But for me, John Clute liked it, and anything John Clute writes, I sort of defer to John because he's the world's greatest SF critic and always has been. But I don't always agree with him. But, you know, he says compulsive reading may be the year's best science fiction novel, Mail on Sunday. So, you know, he's doing some journalism there, review for the money. So, you know, you've got to keep that in mind, not to sort of cast aspersions on his credibility. And it won the Arthur C. Clarke Award in '98. God, I said it was earlier than that. But I can't say I'm that excited by it myself. I was not excited by it myself. So there you go. Right. And finally, Ralph says, Case of Conscience. It didn't work for me. Bold statements, but there you go. And they back up what we've said about the poll, as it were. Grammaticus Books, who runs a nice channel. He's done some nice stuff recently about Rogers and Lasney. I'm not done much of Lasney on this channel, actually. I must do more. It's probably years since I've read any. I do like the really early stuff. He says, anything by Philip K. Dick. Sacrilege, dear boy, sacrilege. It might be just be a me thing, but I just don't get PKD. Well, that's probably because you've read the wrong ones. And of course, when you've got somebody who's written 50 books, it's quite hard. It's quite easy to accidentally pick up the wrong one. And where do you start? It's a big thing. More on that to come in a video coming up in February on PKD. And there's always been a bit of PKD on here. There's also PKD in the club room as well. If you want to join, go to the main screen, which says memberships. Go on, then you can join. It's $4.99 a month. You get an extra video every week, and they're building up. They're building up. There's loads there now. Okay, Exit Libris says, iRobot is completely overrated. I understand it's historically important, but is nearly unreadable as a contemporary adult. The writing is horrible and the ideas are depressingly simple. One of my least favourite books I read last year. Well, it is historically important, but I tend to agree. It's not to do with the fact of it being not contemporary. I think contemporary adults, I'm not going to cast this on Exit Libris, but a lot of contemporary books are written in a very bold, straight ahead style. It's just their iRobot is written in a straight ahead style from that time. It's just not very well written. It's not very well constructed. Are the ideas depressingly simple? At times, yeah, maybe they are, but I haven't read it for a long time, but I completely understand that. But you shouldn't read iRobot first. I stop people doing this in work all the time. I see them reach me and I say, read The Caves of Steel. You know, look up the 3 laws on Wikipedia. I know that's a cheat, but they are in, you know, Caves of Steel. But just read Caves of Steel and Naked Sun. They're far, far better books, far more entertaining, far better written than their novels. And, you know, the characters are just far more interesting. The situations are far more interesting. And they say a lot more about AI. They've got a lot more to say. They're more sophisticated. And I was really struck when I read them because I was a born-again Asimov fan a few years back. And when I read those for the first time, and I was really, really struck by how much they influenced Philip K. Dick, particularly To Android's Dream. It's really quite something. Okay. Peculiar Notion says, as far as good but overrated books, and that's the point, I'm going to say Dune. Expressoric says Dune is definitely overrated. I think it's a great pudding of a novel with very little nutrition. It's tedious and wearisome. I never did get it. An even longer novel, Dahlgren, is also overrated. Shock Horror Probe. So there you go. Dahlgren comes up again. And then you see length is being emphasized. Does a book need to be really long? And as I've said, my view is more often than not, it doesn't. But it's an interesting thing. In the 60s, when Dune, Stranger in a Strange Land, and Lord of the Rings became really popular, they were all big books. And they affected publishing, because since then books have got bigger and bigger and bigger. It's not to say they weren't big books before. They were. You can go back to Don Quixote. That's a huge book. Moby Dick is a huge book. But most novels were relatively compact, especially as modernism took hold. There are some really big ones. There's some small ones as well. And it's an interesting thing. It's the value for money thing. People, I don't like short stories, I like novellas, I want something I can get into and stuff. And often these are people with short attention spans, I find. I just find that really weird. What matters is quality. So that's what he's saying there about a pudding of a novel with very little nutrition. Yeah, I can see that. You think about food and you want a decent meal, you need to be a certain size to fill you up, but it needs to be nutritious. I completely get that. Expresswreck also goes on to say that Roger Zelazny's novels, This Immortal, The Dream Master and Lord of Light, have been praised for their literariness and won awards, but I think they're overhyped. Well, I'm half and half with you on that. I think This Immortal, aka Call Me Conrad, is really good. I think it's very sharp and astringent and tight and vinegary, and I absolutely loved it when I read it. The Dream Master, I think, is a little bit more sort of shaky on that. Lord of Light, which has always been the most famous one, has never really done it for me. I don't like the opening. The whole Hindu god identification thing has never really worked for me. Interestingly, that's sort of done in a way in reverse in Delaney's Einstein intersection, and I think it's done far, far better. And the Einstein intersection to me feels more like This Immortal and Call Me Conrad than Lord of Light. So there you go. So an interesting one. There will be more Zelazny coming up here when I get around to rereading some. Because as I've said before, the big sort of issue for this channel with a lot of these classic names, a lot of these people, I read them decades and decades ago, and I need to go back and reread or to fill in the bits there over I don't have. I am collecting Zelazny at the moment, actually, trying to fill in my gaps, and up to a certain date, because at a certain point he really goes off the boil. Once you get the mid-70s onwards, it's not so great there. I would put a mention out there for his book, Today We Choose Faces, in the early 70s, which I think is fantastic. Really, really great conceptual breakthroughs and amazing cognitive dissonance in that one. Ballardian N7L, or is it N79, I'm not sure, says, overrated, E&M Banks, unreadable space opera, which rightly or wrongly, I don't even consider it SF. Well, I am not a Banks fan. I've made no bones about that. I did a video early days of the channel about that with my friend Tom Toner, who is a huge Banks fan and a published SF writer. And I wouldn't say I find Banks unreadable, though the last time I tried to read a book by him, which was the not The Alchemist, what's it called, The Algebraist, I didn't like it at all, largely because it was leaden in pace. The characters were just adolescent sweary types, and I just got bored with that. And yeah, you don't have to like characters, they don't have to be sympathetic, I've said this before, but it wasn't for me. And of course, the argument is, he says, don't consider SF. Philip K. Dick said that he didn't think space fiction was science fiction because there's nothing new in it, it doesn't have a novum. Well, I would disagree with that, because it is science fiction. It does have things. And okay, it's using a novum which other people have used before, so technically it's not news. But even in his own work, Dick harped on certain themes and did things which weren't new. Obviously, his approach was new, and what he had to say was new a lot of the time. But he used, well-worn tropes as well. He just twisted them and did interesting things with them. And I think that's the point, really. So that's where we are with Ballardian N7L. Paradigm Shift 7907, a good science fiction handle to post for on YouTube, said that they considered Suzanne Collins to be overrated. Well, of course, almost anything that's been published in the last 25 years or so in this sort of YA form is going to be derivative. I mean, it's a straightforward kill game from Sheckley, bloated out. And Paradigm Shift 7907 said that they, and I'm using they because I can't always tell what your gender is, so I'm not doing any sort of fashionable woke nonsense. I just can't tell, and I'm not going to misgender you, don't worry. So I'm just saying they in that broad sort of sense, that they didn't feel that dystopia and science fiction was the same thing. Well, they are. Dystopia is the standard background condition of about 80 to 90% of SF. So by default, if you have a dystopian society, it's got that way through scientific means. The way it gets there in the story is scientifically explicable. Whether it's advanced science that doesn't exist yet, whether it's real science, fictional science, or whether it's the soft science of politics and sociology, that's how it gets there. So that's an important thing. Omnivorous Reader, who I believe has a channel, picks out, some crackers, picks out Three Body Problem and Foundation. Also mentions Solaris as being overrated, which is quite controversial. I think Solaris pops up in most people's sort of top things. And, there is something about the translation. There is a newer translation, which is supposedly much better, which I haven't read. So maybe that's what it is. But I really love Solaris. I have to say I tend to like the parts which are in the book, which are not in the films, which people dislike. Like the whole thing about the problem of knowledge with the solaristic library and 100 years of research and that. I love that. I think that's fantastic because it says a lot about Lem's key theme, which is the problem of knowledge, and how can we know the unknowable? How can we communicate with the truly alien? I think it's an important thing. My sole Lem video goes back about 2 years, and that's called The Problem of Knowledge. And I look at the MIT reissues and talk about those because there are quite a few sort of first contact things in those. They're really interesting books. Things like The Invincible, His Master's Voice, Solaris, and what else? I can see them down here. And also Return from the Stars, which is a slightly different theme, but that's a really good one as well. Omnivorous Reader also mentions Frankenstein. Good grief, sacrilege. This is the Oxford University Press classic edition of the 1818 text, because there are two versions. This was the book as originally published in 1818, when Mary was very young. This is the one where 5% of the text is in Percy Shelley's hand, because it was revised after he died in 1831. And this is the version people are less familiar with, but it is the best version, the most anti-religious one, the most scurrilous one, the harshest one. And I have to say, I prefer it. Recently, what's his name? Is it Brian Lee Durfee, the sword and sorcery writer in the States? He's been on YouTube for years. Don't usually watch his stuff. He reread this and he gave it a thumbs down. And I think that says quite a lot about Brian and his taste. No personal insult meant, of course, but this is one of the great novels. You have to understand its context. This is part of Romanticism. It's the reaction to the classical calm of the Enlightenment, which came just decades earlier. And it also has the real roots of being the first modern science fiction novel. And it's fundamentally important. And while the epistolary form, the frame narrative, all those things may not be to everybody's taste. This is a really important book. And it's also a book about AI, of course. So there you go. You can't really sort of do anything wrong with that. So if you're going to critique this, fair enough. But please tell me exactly why. Why don't you like Frankenstein? Do tell me. And if you want to watch Brian's video, do, because he goes into it quite a bit. But I think most of us, and that's the tyranny of the popular again, will come down on Mary Shelley's side. I also come down on Percy Shelley's side. You notice that. I'll always mention that whenever I talk about this book. Omnivorous Reader also says he thinks that A Canticle for Leibowitz is overrated. I have to say I agree. When I first read Canticle, I loved the first third of it. And then the cyclical view of history with things repeating themselves, the Toynbee-esque thing, I really didn't like. It was too obvious to me. I didn't see... They just didn't happen for me. That first part is sublime. And for me, I'd have preferred it if it had stayed as a novel, with the monks rediscovering, the printed circuit, doing the printed circuit illumination, the shopping list, all that stuff. It's great. But, Miller is probably better in shorter forms. You'll notice he never really wrote much in novel form. In fact, I don't think he did any other novels, did he? Apart from... there's the sequel, which Terry Beeson finished, because he never finished it. So I'm sort of in agreement with that. I don't think the second and third parts of Canticle for Leibowitz have the same sort of level of originality and beauty of writing. I think that first part is absolutely fantastic, though. So there you go. Again, a book which comes heavily laden with expectation. A very interesting book as well, it has to be said. But those second and third parts didn't happen for me. I think that's it. I think finally we're at the end, because I've come down to all the comments I want to mention. Thanks to everybody for commenting. Hope you enjoyed that. And I think one thing we really sort of draw from this is that, you know, if a book is famous, if it comes heavily laden with expectations, like Hyperion or Foundation or any number of other books, then there's a strong chance we're going to find it's overrated. And this is the danger of recommending. In my job, I recommend books all the time, but I will not do it unless I can get a handle on somebody's taste, because one man's meat is another's poison, as they say. And sometimes you have to think about accessibility. If somebody's coming into SF for the first time, there's also the problem that if they come in with things which are not very ambitious or badly written, that will begin to establish this standard for them. And that's the difficulty of starting with something like Andy Weir, I feel. You know, my entry level, obviously it was a different world. You know, it was nearly 60 years ago when I started reading SF. It was over 50 years ago. And I came in with Wells and Wyndham. You know, they were sort of great writers, technically really good English prose stylists and marvelous ideas, good with characters. And so I was lucky, you know, I came in with two of the greatest, and that helped forge my tastes. And it might explain why some of these other readers I mentioned, today, viewers of the channel, have had similar issues to me with a lot of these books. Anyway, what do you think? Put your views underneath. Thanks very much for watching. I'd love to hear from you always. I try and answer as many comments as I can. I can't at the moment because of my fractured wrist, so do forgive me, but feel free to post under this anyway. And I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.